Welcome to Tucker Carlson. Today, if you live in this country, you may be dimly aware that the idea of biological sex is being redefined without our permission, but before our very eyes. You may be too embarrassed to say anything about it, but you may simultaneously sense that a lot is at stake here. It's not just about pronouns. It's not just about language. There's something deeper going on, and we're going to have to live with the consequences. What are those consequences, and what is the actual debate? There's no one better to ask those questions of than Colin Wright, who is an evolutionary biologist. He recently experienced American media directly when a post he posted on Instagram was removed. In that post, he cited a peer-reviewed paper highlighting the biological advantages that men have in sports. That was called hate speech, and so began an amazing journey that has wound up today here in our studio. Colin Wright joins us. Colin, thanks so much for coming on.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
So you're an evolutionary biologist.
At least I was.
At least you were. So
recently.
I think most people instinctively believe that that gives you a platform from which to assess what's going on, a pretty solid platform. But before we assume that, tell us what it is. What is an evolutionary biologist?
Yeah, so it's someone who studies just the way the life has changed over time. So I specifically studied evolutionary behavioral ecology in social insects. So I looked at the fitness consequences of certain types of collective behavior, like how an ant colony collectively behaves to collect food, or how social spiders cooperate and collect food or repair their webs and things like that.
What's a social spider?
Yeah, so there's a lot of
Pardon my ignorance.
different social insects out there. Most people think of spiders as being these solitary hunters, and that's mostly true. But there's a few different groups of spiders that actually sort of form these big colonies, kind of like ants or wasps. There's no queens, but they do live in groups of up to sometimes several hundred individuals, and they'll cooperatively catch prey. They'll raise their offspring together and things like that. So they're a really good model organism for studying animal personalities and collective behavior. So that's what I mainly studied for my PhD.
So you got a doctorate in this?
I did, yeah.
What did you intend to do with it?
So my original plan was to go into academia and be, a tenured professor. That was what I wanted to do 12 years ago when I got into science. It was really my dream because I enjoyed talking about evolution. I thought academia was this environment that, people would judge what you say based on, the evidence that you put forward.
Yes.
And they weren't gonna be ideologically slanted. And I started out getting into evolution because I was interested in sort of the debate with creationists and intelligent design, and this is something that I was very active on online forums. And from inside the universities, it was very much, they were very pro doing this. It was nothing but kudos to me for standing up for what's true in evolution. And that was able to happen because there wasn't a lot of presence of sort of like Christians or right-wing people that are in the university, and so there wasn't a lot of pushback. It wasn't, bad for my career to talk about, what are the faults with creation or intelligent design or something. But when I started criticizing what I view as pseudoscience in the realm of biological sex, people saying that sex is a spectrum, that sex is a social construct, that we can't talk about males and females, but just sort of degrees of maleness and femaleness. To me, this is just complete pseudoscience. But when I started writing actual articles about this, it turns out that I wasn't being told I was just merely wrong for this. I was being told that I'm also a bigot and a transphobe, and that they trotted out claims of being a white supremacist and all of this stuff just for making what I thought was probably the most boilerplate claims I can make as an academic scientist.
So let me ask you about that. So you assumed that this was a non-controversial observation.
Yeah.
In your years of studying social spiders and other insects and solitary arachnids and all the rest, was there any question that biological sex was real and that it played an integral role in the evolution of these species?
Oh, absolutely. So a lot of the same scientists who would call me a transphobe or something for criticizing a lot of the ideology that's coming out in the realm of sex, when you look at their academic literature, they're studying sex differences in certain other animals, in flies, in meadow voles and things like that, and you read their articles and they have no problem talking about male and female meadow voles or male and female flies, but when it comes to humans, they've almost just like sealed this in this little ideological box where you can't talk about sex in the same way with humans as you can about literally any other species on Earth. And this is just something I would try to point out, but there was this major pushback that seems to be just sort of couched in this language of social justice that we need to kind of talk about these terms in really vague ways because we're going to offend somebody if we make
Are
the
there
claim.
transgender meadow voles?
Not to my knowledge. I don't even know how you would measure something like that. I mean, you can look at maybe certain animals in the animal kingdom that might be males that might behave in a more stereotypically female way, but these are behaviors, and this doesn't determine their sex. It's just there's distributions of behavior between males and females of all species, and there's some overlap in the way they behave, and sometimes even in the way they can look, and there are different secondary sex characters. But those don't determine an animal's sex; those are just sort of correlated with sex. So that's something that gets conflated a lot in the whole debate on sex.
And sex is not incidental to the progress of evolution, is it? I mean, it's how the species reproduce, right?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the species. So you'll have a lot of species that they reproduce asexually, and then there's plenty of species that have sex. Sometimes they'll change their reproductive strategy depending on the situation or the environment. But for just about every single mammal, reptiles, many plants, they have the system of having two sexes, males and females. And this really isn't a controversial thing. I mean, the genetic determinants of sex might have been, controversial research or something in the 1660s when we were discovering sort of how these things were inherited, and that gonads were the fundamental basis of your sex. But it's really strange that we're somehow counting this research as controversial, in 2021.
And ominous, I would say. I remember thinking when this first came out, and correct me if I'm wrong because I'm hardly a scientist, but I thought that in human beings, biological sex was determinable through a blood test. I mean, it exists in the DNA, like your DNA can tell you what sex you are. Is that correct?
Yeah, mostly. So there tends to be a conflation. People will say that, we can tell what sex you are by your chromosomes. If you're XX, that means you're female.
Right.
If you're XY, that means you're male. That's not entirely correct. I mean, we knew what biological sex was before we ever knew what a chromosome was.
Of course.
So what we're saying is XX is highly correlated with that, and XY is highly correlated with being a male. What really determines an individual's sex, though, is a gene called SRY. And the SRY gene is one that occurs almost entirely on the Y chromosome. And so it's sort of this master switch that when it's activated, it will make the person's development in utero sort of turn on and have them develop down a male. It makes their gonads sort of turn into testes rather than ovaries.
Yes.
But sometimes that SRY gene can find itself on an X chromosome. So you can get people who are XX and have male anatomy, for instance. So,
they're anomalies,
yeah,
of course.
So when we talk about an individual's sex, we're really talking about how their reproductive system is organized around the production of either making sperm or ova. So it's not necessarily can you produce sperm, do you produce eggs? It really has to do with sort of the design plan of your reproductive anatomy when we're evaluating the sex of a certain individual. And that's completely clear-cut over 99.98% of the time. So
what's interesting, so you just identified the gene that chooses the path of the embryonic human toward male or female. And we know that because we've decoded the human genome, right?
Yeah, for sure.
That's a recent thing. I'm 52. That happened in my lifetime. I remember reading when it happened. And it was almost exactly at that moment that people started to deny biology. I wonder if there's a connection between the two. It's almost like the more we know, the less people want to deal with the implications of what we know, maybe.
Yeah, there was sort of a switching narrative that took place. I don't know how much you were aware of it. And maybe around the 2010s, I just remember this because of the friend circles I was in. I was asked to, and many people were asked, to sort of make this distinction between someone's gender identity and someone's biological sex. It was sort of, sex was considered to be the hardware, if you're male or female, and then they said that gender identity was sort of the software that we have running. Now, I think there's issues with that, but that largely can comport with, we understand that bodies and our minds can sort of vary into some degrees. And then a lot of people bought into that. To a large degree, I did as well. I was like, okay, as long as biologists we have a sharp line between your biology, your sex, and how people identify, I can live with that. And then it just seems in the last couple of years, we've been asked to make another concession, which is to conflate sex and gender completely, or to deny that sex even exists as these stable biological categories. And now people are not just claiming that they're a male who identifies as a female or vice versa, but they're claiming that their identity literally determines what sex they are, and that you cannot just say that I'm a biological male and I identify as a woman, but they're saying I literally identify as a male or a female, the biological terms. And that's sort of when I got off that train, because that was really just blurring the line completely between sort of identity and biology. And as a biologist, it's something I couldn't really stomach.
Because it would be lying, right?
It's completely false at every scale of resolution.
Well, I have so many questions, and I want to get quickly into your experience because it's fascinating, but a couple more big questions. So if you can if you can determine your own sex, which is what the claim is, why can't you determine any other of your physical characteristics, like your race or your height, your eye color? I don't, like, why, like if you're God, then why just stop with your sex?
Yeah, it's really interesting, because we're told to believe that things like your race are socially constructed categories, okay? And to some degree, that is true, even though there's some biological basis for differences in skin color and how, people's ethnicity and things like that. But then we're told to say that these are these categories you can't self-identify into. Like, they'll reject completely anyone who's white who identifies as black, because I agree that would be an absurd thing to do. But yet they're looking at something like sex, which is not a social construct, which is very rigid and completely categorical. Yet some reason they don't have any qualms with identifying in and out of those categories, which are much more rigid than things like race. So it's almost completely backwards. And there's different ways, I guess, in postmodern philosophy that they sort of justify doing that. But to me, it's all pretty insane when you get down to it.
Right. Yeah. And sex is a much more rigid category. I can be half Filipino, I cannot be half female.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So, you just pointed to postmodern philosophy, which is the root of all of this. Did you ever think that would infect the hard sciences, like what you were trained in?
No. So it was largely sealed off from the scientific departments. So I had been familiar with some aspects of critical theory, queer theory, which is this idea that they try to sort of blur the lines between a lot of categories. They have this idea that a lot of binary categories are set up to uphold certain power structures. And I had peeked my head into some of those classrooms before and seen how they talk about males and females and how these are social constructs that are meant to uphold the power structures of oppression on males and females. But I never thought this could get into the biological sciences until I started writing about people doing exactly that, conflating these categories and applying critical theory to things like biological sex, where they try to blur those boundaries between them, and saying because an intersex person could exist and do exist, there are some people who have ambiguous sex traits, therefore sex is just a complete spectrum. You can now identify into whatever category you want to, which makes absolutely no sense, because even if sex were a spectrum, which it isn't, it doesn't therefore imply that you can decide where along that spectrum you actually are.
Well, exactly.
And in most of the cases we have here, so most people who are trans, who want to identify as the opposite sex, these aren't intersex individuals. These aren't people who are sexually ambiguous in any way. These are people who are unambiguously one sex, who are claiming that they are unambiguously the other sex. So the whole argument that because some people might have these intersex conditions, therefore blows up the whole categories of sex altogether, it's just completely nonsensical.
Well, and the idea that the biology department, local state university has to go along with it is a little bit weird. I mean, you could imagine a society in which we allow people to, quote, identify as whatever they want without forcing the rest of us to reorganize what we know about physical reality. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I was always on board
with... So
with...
if you think you're Napoleon, that's not really a threat to my understanding of French history. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly, yeah. I was always... I'm fine doing some degree of social accommodation for people.
That's what I'm saying.
Because if someone's, has gender dysphoria, if they're if they truly feel that they have been born in the wrong body, and it gives them a lot of anxiety and truly a lot of pain that these individuals are going through.
Agree.
That I couldn't be more sympathetic to. And they're doing their best to appear as the opposite sex. I have no problem, referring to this individual as whatever pronoun they would like me to refer them to. If this is what makes them comfortable in my presence, I'm going to be respectful. But we're seeing now this, what I think is a polite social concession that people can make. We're now seeing these things trying to be embedded into laws and into sports categories, and now we're not able to just be an adult in the room and say, we're going to respect you as an individual here in a social way, but now we're saying we need to actually acquiesce to your inner feelings in other realms where it makes no sense.
Well, they have to be imposed on people who disagree or still believe in reality.
Yeah.
Yes, that came as a huge surprise. I mean, speaking for myself, my favorite historian lived as a woman, had transition surgery. James Morris became Jan Morris. We're really one of the great historians and travel writers ever in English. Stayed married to the same woman, as far as I know, never proselytized, whatever. It has no effect on the way I feel about his or her writing. I never imagined a world in which the rest of us would be effectively forced at gunpoint to lie about something so obvious. So it does make you wonder, what's the agenda? What's the point of this? Have you thought about that?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it just seems to be this unwillingness to counter any of the narratives that are coming out of the so-called social justice movement. I mean, there were a lot of individuals who thought they landed on the wrong side of history, I think, with a lot of, with the gay rights movement, for instance. And once gay rights got their big court case and it's become the law of the land, a lot of that money that was funneled into getting gay marriage passed is now being funneled into these very small population, namely transgender individuals and their issues. And so we have this billion-dollar industry that just was already set up to deal with these one set of problems that I thought were legitimate social justice issues, and I think it was a civil rights victory getting marriage passed across the nation. But now this multi-billion-dollar industry is funneling all their money all of a sudden, because once they've achieved what their goal was, now their goal is to just remain in existence. Now they have to find a new goal to do, and so it appears to be they're just going all in on the whole transgender queer theory.
There's any question that you're absolutely right about that. So let's get to how you sort of evolutionary biologist minding his own business wound up at the center of this debate. So you wrote something. I'll put it up on the screen. You put this on Instagram, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which is a social media app for the young people. And yeah, here we go. You say, Instagram took down one of my posts for violating the rules on hate speech. What was the thing I posted? A figure from Fawn of the Beatles and Lexercise's peer-reviewed paper showing male advantage in certain sports activities. Tell us what we're looking at.
So for a long time there had been, so back up a little bit. One of the reasons that got me involved in this debate, especially in biological sex and gender identity stuff, was seeing this breakdown between, what people believe to be males and females and the real consequences that it has in the real world. And one of those real world consequences is sports, male and female sports, which are segregated for very real biological reasons, because males go through male puberty, which changes their bodies in all sorts of ways that gives them a biological advantage. And so for a long time, this has just been assumed, this is just straight up fact, but there really hadn't been a lot of papers that just quantify the magnitude of difference between males and females, because it's just such an obvious thing. It'd almost be like writing a paper that says that gravity is real. Because,
or the sun rises.
Yeah, exactly. These are just
we have
knowledge.
Thousands of years of records of human performance.
Yes, I mean this is
that illustrate
it's one of those things that you just use your eyes and you can see that this is clearly a real phenomenon in nature. And so in response to these people claiming that males and females aren't actually different in athletic ability, it's merely upbringing and how much they're encouraged to go into certain sports, which is insane. A friend of mine, named is Emma Hilton, and one of her colleagues, they wrote a review paper looking at all the different papers from the effects of going on cross-sex hormones and how this influences your performance as a trans athlete compared to to female athletes. And what they found is that even after 3 years of cross-sex hormone therapy, the amount of strength that is reduced is only really about 5%. So, and the gap between males and females' sporting advantage is between 10 and sometimes 50%.
Right.
And so, in their paper, they looked at quantifying the actual male advantage over a range of sporting activities. And so that's what you see in this figure here. This is just the average male advantage across these sporting activities. It ranges from things like rowing to, I think in the high end is then like weightlifting and how fast you can throw a baseball, which is one of the biggest differences. So I just posted this image from a scientific peer-reviewed paper in Sports Medicine, which is maybe the top 1 or 2 sports medicine journals in the world in terms of its impact factor, and just posting a photo of a peer-reviewed article's figure was to Instagram. They said it was hate speech. And I didn't even get a chance to review it for, you made a mistake. Because on the bottom they said, if we think we've made a mistake, you can have it go for review. And when I tried to do that, it had already been reviewed. It had been pre-reviewed. And so a human went in there and actually said, yes, this is hate speech, this peer-reviewed article showing the difference in male advantage in sports is hateful.
This kind of stuff, I guess, is so common now. I worry that we're becoming a nerd to it, where we just assume that, like, saying true things in public is a death penalty offense. But tell us, as someone who's not from originally the world of politics, what was your reaction when that happened?
Well, at first I thought it was due to like a mass flagging campaign. I thought just a bunch of activists had went on there and flagged it and tagged it, because sometimes that happens.
Yes.
And then the algorithm will just remove a post. And so I thought that's what happened. And I was like, oh, that makes sense, because a lot of times activists they'll peruse my social media because they want to find anything that they can use to, to call me names or something. And so I just I figured I could have this reviewed. And then once it turned out that it was actually reviewed by a real human and it was still flagged as hate speech, that's when I realized it was kind of really ridiculous at this point. This wasn't just a mass flagging campaign, or at least that could have been the initial reason that got it removed, but that it also passed the secondary review of being hate speech. So that's...
What did you do?
I went on social media to point it out. That's the main thing I did. That's really the only thing I could do, because I didn't have an avenue within Instagram to protest the removal of it at all.
Did they ever put it back up?
No, it's been removed ever since.
So what does that make you think?
It's a kind of a bizarre place that we're currently in, where you can't make the most introductory biology 101 claims about sex differences without these things being considered hate speech. I worry about how this is filtering into universities, how it not only affects the type of scholarship that's being put out, because people don't want to write about these things. I mean, I had been approached by some journals recently that want me to write about things that I've talked about here, why sex isn't a spectrum, why it's not a social construct. And I think that's really revealing that they have to go to someone who's no longer in academia to write these articles, because they can't find anybody within the current academic system who would probably, frankly, be more qualified than me, who might be developmental biologists, to write about this stuff. They can't find these people. So they have to talk to me about getting these articles written for them, because it can be career suicide, and I don't have an academic career to implode anymore. I've already sort of self-imploded it by leaving. So
and you believe, this is probably just a rhetorical question, but there's no chance of you ever having tenure anywhere at this point?
Oh no, that's long gone. I left academia in the year 2000. Yeah, after a massive campaign to sort of destroy my reputation in the field.
Purely on the basis of your scientifically supported claim that there are sex differences in nature.
Yeah, I had an article come out in the Wall Street Journal that was specifically talking about, it was called The Dangerous Denial of Sex, and it talked about what sex is and why its denial is harmful to several different groups, such as like women, children, and also the gay community. And so this was, it went pretty viral, as you can imagine, something in the Wall Street Journal on that topic being. And a lot of people at my university at Penn State, students, said that they felt unsafe with the fact that I was on campus. A lot of other professors at the university.
Unsafe? Did you try and kill anyone, or no?
Nope, I was just poking ants and wasps in my lab, as I did every single day there. I'm not hiding in the bushes. really trying to attack, trans and non-binary students as they walk by. So, but apparently they felt unsafe on campus. Now I'll give Penn State kudos. They didn't cave into any demands. I wasn't fired or anything. I left on my own volition. But it was sort of a really bad environment as an academic to live in while I was there. Being denounced constantly by my colleagues, being called a bigot, being called
Professors
a transphobe.
joined in?
Oh yeah, no, on social media, for sure. There was a campaign that people did where they would post on the biggest job boards in my field. It's called Evo Eco Jobs, and they would just post jobs. Then the job listing, all it said was Colin Wright is a transphobe and a race scientist. They just threw in racism claims as jobs so that thousands of my colleagues could see these things.
How did they get to the racism part?
So I had criticized the inclusion of Caster Semenya, who is a South African athlete who competes as a female, although they're a biological male that has this intersex condition, and I thought it was unfair that Caster was competing against females, given that she has XY chromosomes and has gone through male puberty to a large degree. But since Caster Semenya is black, I was told that I didn't actually care, that it wasn't because she had gone through male puberty, it was because she was a black woman, and that I'm just using sort of my Western approach of what femininity should look like in order to say that this black woman shouldn't be able to compete against females. So that's why I was accused of being a white supremacist and a racist.
I wonder if there's ever been a larger collection of loathsome people in human history than the people at our universities. Do you think?
I mean, up until recently, I wouldn't have agreed with you, but what I was sort of put through, just given my, the claims that I made, and I'm not a provocateur. I
can tell that's what's exercising me. You speak so precisely.
I'm not like a Milo Yiannopoulos type character
I get it.
where I'm trying to antagonize people. I've literally only just out of complete concern, with also all the caveats you could ever imagine of being sympathetic towards trans individuals and hoping they seek comfort for their dysphoria. I'm just trying to make claims. I'm just trying to keep us on the right page about what's biology, what's not, why it matters that we acknowledge that we're a sexually dimorphic species. It's been really eye-opening, to say the least, to see the response among my colleagues, not just colleagues I don't know, but colleagues that I knew very, very well, some who've even shared labs with me and I've been in the field for months with, just doing a complete about-face and calling me, horrible names.
People you know personally?
Oh, yeah. I'd say about half of the people that I was in academia with now think I'm close to the devil.
Even though their own research bolsters your claims?
Even though they study things like sex differences in their own model organisms, yeah. And they have no problems distinguishing between male and female fruit flies or male and female meadow voles or whatever they happen to be studying.
You've mentioned meadow voles a couple of times. Tell us about a meadow vole. I just can't. I know this is parenthetical, but
I don't know too much about them, but they are studied in behavioral ecology a lot for like sex differences and.
A vole is like a little rodent.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a model organism for many things, just because they can be kept in the lab and they reproduce really quickly, so you can look at them over generations. And they study territoriality and sex differences and behavior. Yeah, it's a common organism.
Interesting. I can't even imagine how difficult that must have been. I mean, it's one thing if some unhappy people on Twitter or someone the Human Rights Campaign has hired to assassinate your character does that. But to have actual academics whose work presumably you respect, who you know personally, who know what you're like, who know your character, denounce you in public. What was that like?
Yeah, it was an awkward situation for sure. Because a lot of these people, they knew me as a person. It's just someone I've spent a lot of times with in the lab, and we'd shared a lot of intimate moments and things in there. But being in grad school together, being mentored by these people, so it was incredibly shocking to see this complete turnabout in a lot of.
How'd you handle it?
I tried to have these conversations with them. I said, if we ever want to talk about these things, I'm more than welcome to speak about these. A lot of these friends were people that I had even prided our relationship in being able to bridge sharp disagreements and always be friends on the other end of it. We could talk about anything, and still this seemed to be beyond the pale. And a lot of them even admitted that they hadn't even read some of the articles I wrote, but they just heard about them or they saw the title and they just thought I was going down some dark path of bigotry or something. So, yeah. So it really just showed the stark political polarization. Even though I'm always considered myself on the left. I've never voted for a Republican in my life.
Yes.
Who knows how that will change in the future? But it's been a bizarre to see. Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with the focus in universities on like these diversity, equity, and inclusion statements. A lot of times these things are used not only as to apply for jobs in the first place, but they're used for getting tenure and any sort of promotion that you get. And so a lot of current academics, they don't have a lot of opportunities to work outside of the universities, especially if you study something like I did, like the behavior of social spiders. You can't. There's not a big job market like that in the private industry.
You can't go to the social spider industry.
Yeah. There's not. At least this doesn't exist yet. Maybe in the future, but they really don't have an option because I refuse to sort of write these diversity, equity, and inclusion statements because it's basically a political litmus test. And so a lot of people who are currently in academia, they don't really have a choice. They need to double down on these ideologies. And so when they see someone like me talking about this, they can't be seen taking my side publicly because, well, they're taking the side of this transphobic race scientist or something. And that's not going to look good on their CV. And so a lot of them just would issue these public denunciations, these Maoist apologies that were quite frankly shocking because a lot of these same people had told me early on that, when I was saying that people are denying sex was real, they would say, you're crazy, no one's saying that. And then it moved from, okay, well, they're saying that, but it's not a big deal, to then, okay, they're saying it, and it's a good thing because they're right. And that's sort of the evolution that I saw several of my colleagues go through. And, I have the receipts and the saved emails and tweets to prove it. So, it's really a bizarre.
Have you gone after them by name?
No, I don't want to reveal who they are.
Yeah.
I'm not interested in trying to ruin their careers or anything like that. They're doing their own thing. I'm fine dealing with their arguments, but I'm not gonna.
Good for you.
I don't want to sully anyone else's careers. I mean, they're good. They're fundamentally good people. I just think they're extremely misguided and confused, and their priorities are not completely set.
I mean, how does that make you feel about the future of science in the country?
It really depends. I think if you're studying meadow-voles or something, this is something that's not politically charged to any degree. I think the science is going to be fine. Cancer research, probably fine. People making high-speed, high-energy lasers, probably fine. But any sort of scientific question that touches on, even tangentially to some sort of political influence that might have any remote relationship with anything political, I don't really trust a lot of the research that comes out
So
there.
the Soviet Union produced, some usable science, but not much, considering that they put a huge emphasis on it. They had a fairly successful space program. Like, they had the technology and the will to produce usable science, but they didn't produce as much as they should have, and they also produced a lot of crap.
Yeah.
Because politics intruded into every part of Soviet science. So, why wouldn't that happen here? Why wouldn't cancer research be affected by political imperatives? If you can force a scientist to lie about one thing, why can't you force them to lie about other things?
I suppose it could happen. It would depend on the specific type of theory they're working with. But I think right now what we're dealing with is sort of any idea, any area of study that goes against sort of any sort of social justice narrative is where we get into the weeds. So if anyone's studying sex differences in behavior or the biology of sex in general, these are controversial areas, at least it's seen right now. People who are studying things like police shootings and racial disparities and those types of things. I mean, we saw during the protests in the summer a big article in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that showed that there weren't any differences between police shootings between black and white individuals. This paper got retracted. The authors retracted the paper, not because there was anything wrong with the data or anything like that,
right,
but because they said that the results were being misrepresented by people like Heather McDonald in the Wall Street Journal, even though she wasn't misrepresenting it. They just were getting a lot of backlash because this type of paper didn't go, with the narrative we have on police shootings, and so that had to be memory hold. And so now it's unclear to me whether you could even publish a paper that would show, that would contradict sort of these left-wing narratives on police shootings or sex. I mean, we see one of the things that got me to speak up was when Nature, the biggest magazine, most prestigious scientific magazine in the world, published these memos that were saying that someone's biological sex has no bearing whatsoever on their, could not be determined by genetics or anatomy to any degree, which is probably the most incorrect statement I can possibly imagine making as a biologist. So yeah, we're through the looking glass on a lot of these things.
I just don't. I hope you're right, but I just have trouble believing it's going to remain siloed into these couple of issues. I mean, genetics determines health outcomes to a huge extent. Regardless of your background, all kinds of illnesses that affect different groups differently. That's always been true, obviously. Yeah. And so, if you can't acknowledge that biology's role in anything, how can you do research into that?
Yeah, I mean, we have seen some of that with COVID when you see
I've noticed.
Yeah, with the how it affects certain communities more than others, and this is evidence of systemic racism or something because it happens to affect black people more than it affects white people. I don't know if that has to do with the genetics or differences in
there might be all kinds of different reasons, but if
like
you
that,
can't have the conversation about it even.
Yeah, no, it could definitely, I mean, the whole equity push in things like medicine is extremely concerning, not only in the type of research that's being done, but the applications and how we're actually, are we going to start giving out sort of medical treatment along racial lines?
Well, we already are.
Which we were seeing happen
now.
Currently, yeah.
Now.
Yeah.
Now. This weekend.
Extremely shocking.
So, okay, this has been super depressing, but interesting. Tell us about, without using names, people currently conducting science who agree with you that you should be honest no matter what you find. I mean, are there people who are reaching out to you and congratulating you on your bravery?
There's a lot of people that I know personally, and there's a lot of people who reach out to me very regularly who are still in the sciences, who can't really talk about these things and who are worried they can't get promotions because it's being tied to these diversity, equity, and inclusion statements that they have to do, or that they have to be promoting diversity, equity, inclusion in their research directly. So yeah, it's a lot of them.
In their research?
Yes, a lot of I was asked when I was applying for jobs, and again, my research, I focused on collective personalities in social insects and arachnids. I was specifically asked to talk about how my research furthers equity and inclusion.
This is so freaking crazy and Soviet.
Yeah,
it's hard to believe it's real.
And a lot of times, so what's really pernicious about these is they're often used as a first filter for getting an academic job.
Of course, that's right.
And so this would lead you to think of, people like Einstein, for instance. Would they have written a compelling diversity, equity, and inclusion statement? Would we have wanted someone like Einstein to even look up at their workbench for a second to do anything other than, look at the physics of light and gravity? I mean, any sort of mental work that he does, I think, should have been focused on their science rather than these other programs, because I'm not qualified to make a program on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I was, presumably being hired because I was going to be a scientist working on collective personalities in insects. But this is sort of a way that they filter out certain individuals with certain ideologies that they don't really want.
Are there enough people in biology departments, for example, who are committed to the truth to at some point, hold the line on this stuff, or no?
I think there are. They're increasingly reluctant to speak out, given they see what happens to people like me and other individuals like Dorian, who speaks out against
Dorian Abbott.
Dorian Abbott, who you had on before. They see these people get targeted and get disinvited to give certain talks, which will reflect whether or not you can get tenure or promotions.
Of course.
Too. These are important talks to give. People see that happen. And they change their behavior accordingly. What I'm extremely worried about is so right now we have people who are being too quiet, and it's usually the older scientists who are the ones who would agree with me mostly. Some of them are just straight up retiring, and so we're kind of the academic makeup, the political makeup is shifting more towards these social justice type people due to retirement. And we're also changing the pipeline because we're not hiring people. We have the political litmus tests of the DEI statements of people going into science in the first place who are getting these jobs to replace these individuals who are leaving. And then we're getting a lot of students now who I get emails from them very, very regularly saying that they wanted to be a microbiologist, but they refuse to write these diversity, equity, inclusion statements. And so they're not even choosing academia in the first place.
Can I ask you, for our viewers who have never been asked to write a diversity, equity, inclusion statement, by the way, every person on principle should refuse, in my view, but what is it? So what does that mean exactly?
Yeah, so it's very vague what they want, but if you ever go to sort of these DEI sessions where they teach you how to write these, you need to basically mumble a lot of social justice slogans. You need to point to group level disparities and things and talk about systemic racism as being the problem for what's leading to these group level disparities across the board. You need to talk about, in some instances, they make you list all the different racial and sexual minorities that you've ever mentored, so you can, collect them all on this sheet and then, basically get rid of all of their individuality and just reduce them down to a single data point of, the student was trans, this person was black, this person was, whatever, and then use them to say, look how progressive I am. I'm mentoring these types of individuals. If you go on the UC Berkeley website, they'll actually have a rubric of how they grade these things, so you can actually see what exactly they're looking for, what's considered a very good diversity, and equity and inclusion statement. And they even state, frankly, on there that you can't disagree with things like the use of racial affinity groups, which is, in my opinion, just the equivalent of racial segregation. I'm going into these different rooms with people of like race so they can sort of have a safe space away from other individuals that don't look like them. And it says very specifically you're not to disagree with these types of policies. So that's something I couldn't bring myself to do because I fundamentally believe that's an immoral thing. I don't think segregation, this seems like the opposite of inclusion and diversity. And so this is something that
I can see why you're a successful biologist, because you look at things and you just evaluate them on their own terms. What are we looking at here? Yeah,
what's the end goal? And it's almost the opposite is true. When you look at inclusion is all about excluding individual diversity. It's just about diversity of things like skin color and these immutable characteristics, and not what I think is the most important part of diversity in universities would be the diversity of thought, diversity of viewpoint. This is how we find each other's different blind spots when we're working on scientific questions, so we can cover each other's basis. You always want to have an individual who's coming from at a left field to say why you're wrong, because if you have everyone around you who believes exactly the same thing, well, you're not going to be able to point out those ideological blind spots that everybody has. And so this was one thing that I would always protest against in writing these statements, was I always tried to champion viewpoint diversity. And we can't simply just use diversity of skin color as a proxy. Sometimes it's related to it, sometimes it's not. But that shouldn't be the primary type of diversity that universities are championing.
That's for sure. You look at these MSNBC panels, and there's invariably some black professor from Princeton who has exactly and precisely the same life experience and opinions as every other entitled white liberal on the panel.
Oh, yeah.
That's diverse? Huh?
Yeah. No, it makes absolutely no sense.
Right.
And the fact that almost every university is now championing this type of diversity, I just think it's completely insane. Yeah.
So what are you going to do with your life now? I mean, first of all, I'm sorry, because you bought into the promise of the American system, which is meritocratic, and it turned out to be a lie. So
it was shocking.
Bad. Yeah.
It's worked out. I think what I'm doing now, I'm an editor for Quillette, which is a magazine dedicated to free thought, which I couldn't be more happy to work. They came to the rescue when I was leaving academia and gave me a really good job that allowed me to write about the things that I wasn't able to write about as an academic, or at least not without great consequences. I'm also working as an editor for FAIR, the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, which is a new organization modeled again after sort of what the ACL used to be for.
Yes.
But it sort of pushes back against a lot of these types of hyper focus on race and race consciousness and so-called critical race theory types things. We offer a wide range of new types of curricula for schools to use for education, and I think it's a fantastic organization that people should get into.
Boy, this is not the path you intended to take.
It's wildly different, but it's been fun. I can work from home now, whereas in academia you're sort of always chasing the funding, so you have to accept any job that they give you, no matter where it is. So I now have the ability to write and think freely about things, which is what I thought academia would be for, but it turns out that space is now outside of academia. So I found the space I was looking for eventually. It just wasn't where I thought it was going to be.
So since you spent your previous career looking at animals, assessing animals, watching them and coming to conclusions about them, assess the relative merits of the people. So like compare the people you now interact with, are friends with, have something in common with the people you once worked with in academia.
See, I don't know if there's... When I was in academia, the friends I had, they were fantastic. They were great people. And it wasn't up until recently that a lot of their ideology seems to just have completely shifted. So I can't really say that when I was there that anything really stood out as
So what do you think? Okay, then
problematic.
that's super interesting. Why do you think, first of all, when is there like a demarcation line, like when that started to happen? Can you pinpoint it? And then why do you think it happened?
I mean, it seems to have been slowly ramping up since, I would say, around 2013, 14. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it really came on the forefront of my radar in 2016.
Yeah.
That's sort of when a lot of stuff went really crazy.
Obama's second term and then Trump.
Yeah. So that just sort of radicalized a lot of individuals during Trump's election, that really spurred on these accusations of racism just being hurled, across without any inhibition completely. So that was when things started really heating up, and then it was just really the ideological fracturing and both sides sort of moving into the extremes. I think the left sort of moved further left than the right moved right. People will disagree with me on that, but at least a lot of the friends that I had, they became very more authoritarian and not really open to other points of view that seemed to contradict a lot of these social justice.
And they weren't like that before?
Not that I could detect, no. But a lot of the people that I talk to now, they've sort of remained that, what I would consider the true liberal type, whereas they're open to these different information. I can talk to people who are Christians, who might even be those same creationists I used to disagree with back in the day, and write on these internet forums, and I consider them my good friends now, because we can disagree and agree to disagree, which is, I think, one of the most important things you can do.
Yes.
And I'm having better conversations now than I've had in a long time, and I don't know what people are talking about in academia so much anymore, but I get little whiffs of it because I still get emails sometimes, because I'm somehow still on the email list for a lot of my academic positions. So I see some back and forth, and they all have pronouns in their bio now, and it seems pretty like a ideological monoculture, in my opinion.
Last question. You have this wonderful tweet I want to put on the screen, because I think it applies to all of us, because we're living in a world where people are increasingly demanding to hear our pronouns. You write this: if you reject gender ideology, the proper response to what are your pronouns is, I don't agree with the ideological framework that is producing that question. Love that answer. I have another answer that includes the F word, which I'm not going to say on the air, but this is a much smarter and more thoughtful answer. The ideological framework that is producing that question, what is that what does that mean? What is the ideological framework producing that?
Yeah, so it's hard to get a straight answer if you're talking to someone who I would say is a proponent of gender ideology. But basically, it really boils down to this notion of what makes a man or a woman, which, when you start prodding their ideology of what it means to identify as a man or identify as a woman, it always seems to boil down to this identifying with these stereotypes of masculinity and femininity. When you say people say they identify as a woman, and if they're a biological male, you say, well, what do you mean when you identify as a woman? And they say, I just might feel very feminine, or I'm living as a woman. Well, what does it mean to live as a woman? When you ask them to define what a woman is, it's usually very circular. It's anyone who identifies and lives as a woman. That doesn't tell you what a woman actually is. So you sort of have to pick or sort of look at what they're saying in a more holistic sense. And what it does boil down to is these stereotypes of masculinity and femininity. So when people ask you what your pronouns are, or how you identify and ask you what your pronouns are, what they're really asking you is, what type of stereotypes do you identify with? And so, in my opinion, I don't identify with a stereotype. I refer to myself as a man because I'm an adult human male.
Right.
And that's, I'm not, on some things I'm more masculine, on some things I'm probably more feminine. I'm not like Randy Macho Man Savage. That's not really my persona. And so, to some degree, masculine and femininity is a spectrum. And so we get this individuals who are identifying as something like non-binary. And what that means is they just don't identify with these cultural expectations or these stereotypes of masculinity and femininity. And to me, that's not what pronouns refer to. And so if you say that you're a female and you identify as a woman, if you say, oh, my pronouns are she, her, you might think you're referring to your sex. But according to the ideology, the gender ideology that's producing that question, they want to know of what stereotypes are you embracing. And I just fundamentally disagree that your manhood and womanhood is defined based on whether or not you identify with stereotypes that are often very regressive that are associated with your sex. I think pronouns refer to your age partially. If you're a man, you're an adult human male. If you're a woman, you're an adult human female. Boys are child, males who are children, etc. That's my view on the issue. I think most people would probably agree with that. And again, I think the ideology that's producing it, that's basing it on stereotypes, is incredibly regressive, and it's not something that we should really assent to. And using
and
these
very
pronouns,
noticeable too.
And by stating your pronouns or just caving into these pronoun rituals, you are tacitly just agreeing with that ideology. You're working within their framework, and I fundamentally disagree with it, and so I just don't think you should answer that question.
I love that. Colin Wright, that was great. I appreciate you taking the time to come and tell us about all that.
Thank you so much.
And I'm glad that you're doing this instead of studying social spiders.
It was fun doing that, but I'm happy with what I'm doing.
Good. I am too. You're doing this. Thank you. Colin Wright. Tucker Carlson today's the name of the show. New episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday on Fox Nation. We'll see you every weeknight, 8 p.m. Eastern on the Fox News Channel.